For some time I've been asked to produce a video that shows how the Portable Wargame works. After some thought, I decided to choose the rules from the Portable Colonial Wargame book, and as for my scenario, I decided upon the attack on Morobad. Now, my interest in the attack on Morobad stems really from when I first bought Joseph Morshau's How to Play Wargames in Miniature, which features some wonderful photographs of his 54mm figures, all Britons I believe, mounted on bases and fighting out battles on a squared grid. He also has a photograph in Donald Featherstone's book which shows the same figures being used to attack the Great Wall of Morobad, which itself was part of a long-running campaign that was fought using Jack Scrooby's Mafrica. I chose the simplest set of rules from the Portable Colonial Wargame, the ones that are entitled The Gatling's Jammed. I set up a 12 by 12 grid, put the Great Wall of Morobad down in one corner, and placed some trees at various locations to give some cover to the attackers. When I transferred this to the tabletop, you can see that I used a square of felt with each corner of the squares marked with a red dot. This I find makes the grid less intrusive. The trees were cake decorations that I bought from America, and they're mounted in bases that are made from Firemo. This is a heat treated putty like plasticine stuff that you shape, and when you're ready you put it in the oven for a few minutes and it bakes hard. Obviously I did it without the trees attached, otherwise the trees would have melted, but they do make very, very suitable tree bases. The Great Wall of Morobad is actually constructed from modules from a modular fortress that I built using very cheap wooden Jenga-like blocks from the works. These were stuck together on 50mm by 50mm square bases, and you can see they make quite a convincing modular fortress corner. The attacking British force was a combined British and Egyptian infantry brigade. It was commanded by General Willesden Green and consisted of A and B companies of the Wessex Rangers, A and B companies of the Guides Infantry Regiment, A and B companies of the Mackay Highlanders, the 1st and 2nd companies of the 1st Egyptian Infantry Regiment, A Field Battery Royal Artillery, the 1st Field Battery of the Egyptian Artillery, and the Machine Gun Company of the Loyal Kent Regiment. The brigade had a total strength of 44 strength points and an exhaustion point of 15 strength points. The outnumbered Haussarian defenders were led by the Sultan of Morobad. They comprised 6 bands of Haussarian infantry armed with muskets and a battery of smoothbore field guns. The infantry were the 1st and 2nd Haussarian red turbans, the 1st and 2nd Haussarian white turbans, the 1st and 2nd Haussarian cream turbans, and the 1st Haussarian field battery. The Haussarians had a total strength point of 32 strength points and an exhaustion point of 11 strength points. Before the battle, the Sultan deployed the 1st and 2nd Haussarian red turbans in the largest of the clumps of palm trees, and the rest of his army along the walls of the Great Wall of Morobad. During the first turn, the Haussarians had the initiative, but chose to do nothing. The Anglo-Egyptian brigade began its approach to Morobad. It advanced in battalion columns with the Egyptians on the right. In the second turn, the Anglo-Egyptians had the initiative and moved first and moved forward. This brought them within range of the muskets of the Red Turbans, who opened fire on the loyal Kent Regiment's machine gun company and the leading company of the Guides Infantry Regiment. The first Red Turbans fired at the machine gun company. They threw a d6 die and the score was 4. When an additional factor of +1 was added in because the Hausarians had not moved this turn, the loyal Kent Regiment's troops were hit. A further d6 die was rolled to resolve what happened, and a score of 5 forced the machine gun company to retreat a grid area. The second Red Turbans fired at A Company of the Guides Infantry Regiment. They threw a d6 die and the score was 1. When an additional factor of +1 was added in because the Hausarians had not moved this turn, the second Red Turbans' fire proved to be ineffective. At the beginning of turn 3, the 1st Hausarian Field Battery fired at A Field Battery, the Royal Artillery. They threw a d6 die and the score was 1. When an additional factor of +1 was added for the artillery unit having direct line of sight to the target grid area, the 1st Hausarian Field Battery's fire was deemed to have been ineffective. The Hausarians moved first this turn, and having engaged the oncoming British, the Red Turbans then withdrew through the clump of palm trees. The British responded by deploying the loyal Kent Regiment's machine gun company so that it could open fire on any Hausarian troops in the clump of trees. It also moved A and B companies of the Guides Infantry Regiment forwards to engage the Hausarian troops in the clump of palm trees. This brought A Company of the Guides Infantry Regiment into close combat with the 2nd Red Turbans. Both sides threw a d6 die. The d6 die score of A Company of the Guides Infantry Regiment was 4, and when -1 was deducted because the enemy unit was in cover, A Company of the Guides Infantry Regiment was unaffected by the close combat. The 2nd Red Turbans' d6 die score was 1, and when -1 was deducted because the enemy unit was in cover, the 2nd Red Turbans were hit and had to resolve the effect of the close combat. It's worth noting that in this version of the Portable Wargame rules, players threw dice to determine the effects of close combat on their own units rather than their enemies. Low dice scores therefore tended to result in bad effects. A further d6 dice was thrown, and the d6 die score was 6. The 2nd Red Turbans could either retreat 1 grid area or lose 1 strength point. Although they could have retreated, the 2nd Red Turbans chose to remain in the clump of palm trees and lose 1 strength point. Whilst this was going on, A Field Battery of the Royal Artillery deployed so that they could begin to fire at the Great Wall of Morobad during the next turn. At the same time, the Egyptian troops, who were unaffected by the fighting on their left, continued to move forward. At the beginning of turn 4, both sides' artillery fired first. The 1st Hausarian Field Artillery Battery opened fire on A Field Artillery Battery of the Royal Artillery. It threw a d6 die and the score was 2. When +1 was added for the artillery unit having direct line of sight to the target grid area, and another +1 for firing at the same stationary target during the previous turn, were added in, the 1st Hausarian Battery's fire was deemed to be ineffective for a second time. A Field Artillery, Royal Artillery, fired at the Great Wall of Morobad. It threw a d6 and the score was 5. When +1 was added because the artillery unit had a direct line of sight to the target area, and another +1 was added because there was a friendly commander in the same grid area as the firing field artillery unit, the fire of the A Battery Royal Artillery hit the Great Wall of Morobad and began to demolish a section of it. The Hausarians moved first this turn, and the 2nd Red Turbans counterattacked A Company of the Guides Infantry Regiment. Both sides threw a d6 die. The second red turban's d6 die score was 5, and when -1 was deducted because the enemy unit was in cover, the red turbans were unaffected by the close combat. The guides also threw a d6 die, and their score was 4, and when -1 was deducted because the enemy was in cover, the guides' infantry regiment was also unaffected by the close combat. The first red turbans then moved forward and engaged a company of the guides' infantry regiment in close combat from the flank. Both sides threw a d6 die. The first red turban's d6 die score was 1, and when +1 was added because they were attacking the flank of an enemy, and -1 was deducted because the enemy was in cover, their die score meant that they lost 1 strength point. A company of the Guides Infantry Regiment, their die score was 3, and when -1 was deducted because they were being attacked in the flank by an enemy unit, and another -1 because the enemy unit was in cover, they were also lost 1 strength point. The Loyal Kent Regiment's machine gun company opened fire on the first red turbans. They threw 3 d6 dice, and the scores were 2, 4 and 6, and when +1 for the firing unit not having moved this turn was added, and -1 as the enemy unit was in cover was deducted, the Loyal Kent Regiment's machine gun company hit the first red turbans once. To resolve the effects of the fire, the first red turbans threw a d6 dice. The d6 die score was 3, and the first red turbans lost another strength point. Whilst this fighting was going on, A and B companies of the Wessex Rangers and A and B companies of the Mackay Highlanders moved forward on the left. At the same time, the Egyptian forces continued their advance on the right. By the end of this turn, it was obvious that the British were going to try and mount a two-sided attack, with the Egyptians attacking from one flank, whilst the main force of British troops attacked head-on towards the gates. At the start of the turn, both sides fired their artillery. The 1st Towserian Field Battery fired at A Field Battery Royal Artillery. It threw a d6 die, and the score was 3. When +1 for the artillery unit having a direct line of sight to the target grid area, and +1 for firing at the same stationary target during the previous turn were added in, the 1st Towserian Field Battery's fire had hit A Field Battery Royal Artillery. To resolve the effect of the fire on the Field Artillery Battery, the Royal Artillery Field Battery threw a d6 die. The d6 die score was 5, and the Royal Artillery Battery could either retreat 1 grid area or lose 1 strength point. It chose to stay where it was and lost 1 strength point. Because General Green was in the same grid area as A Field Battery Royal Artillery, 2 6 die were thrown to see if it had been killed or wounded. The d6 die scores were 3 and 6, totaling 9, so he escaped injury or death. A Field Battery Royal Artillery fired at the Great Wall of Morobad. It threw a d6 die, and the score was 4. When +1 for the artillery unit having a direct line of sight to the target grid area, +1 for firing at the same stationary target during the previous turn, and +1 for having a friendly commander in the same grid area as the firing artillery unit were all added in, A Field Battery Royal Artillery had hit the Great Wall of Morobad for a second time, and visible cracks had begun to develop. The Anglo-Egyptians moved first this term, and A Company of the Guides Infantry Regiment engaged the 2nd Red Turbans in close combat. Both sides threw a d6 die. The Guides' d6 die score was 4, and when -1 was deducted because the enemy was in cover, they were unaffected by the close combat. The Red Turbans' d6 die score was 2, and when -1 was deducted because their enemy was also in cover, they were hit and had to resolve the effect of the close combat. A further d6 die was thrown, and the score was 2, as a result of which the Red Turbans lost 1 strength point. The Loyal Kent Regiment's machine gun company opened fire on the first Red Turbans. It threw 3 d6 die, and the scores were 2, 5 and 6. And when 1 was added in for the firing unit not having moved this turn, and 1 was deducted because the enemy was in cover, the Loyal Kent Regiment's machine gun company had hit the first Red Turbans twice. To resolve the effect of the fire, the first Red Turbans threw a d6 twice. The first d6 die score was 1, and the Red Turbans lost 1 strength point. The second d6 die score was 5, and the first Red Turbans could either retreat 1 grid area or lose 1 strength point. They chose to retreat rather than to lose that strength point. A company of the Mackay Highlanders moved forward and opened fire on the Hausarian White Turbans who were lining the Great Wall of Morobad. The Mackay Highlanders threw a d6 die, and the score was 6. When -1 was deducted because the enemy unit was in cover, a company of Mackay Highlanders had hit the first White Turbans. To resolve the effect of the fire, the first White Turbans threw a d6 die. Their score was 2, and they therefore lost 1 strength point. A company of the Wessex Rangers moved forward and opened fire on the Sultan, who was on top of the main gate. They threw a d6 die, and their score was 2. When -1 was deducted because the target was in cover, Wessex Rangers' fire had missed. Keeping well out of range of the defenders' muskets, the Egyptians continued their advance on the right. It was now time for the Hausarians to respond. The second Red Turbans mounted yet another counter-attack on A Company of the Guides Infantry Regiment. Both sides threw a d6 die. The Red Turbans' d6 die score was 3, and when -1 was deducted because their enemy was in cover, they were hit and had to resolve the effect of the close combat. A further d6 die was thrown. The Red Turbans scored 3, and they lost 1 strength point. A Company of the Guides Infantry Regiment's die score was 1, and when -1 was deducted because their enemy was also in cover, they were hit and also had to resolve the effect of the close combat. Their further d6 dice score was 2, and they also lost 1 strength point. The first Red Turbans now charged forward through the palm trees to attack A Company of the Guides Infantry in the flank. Both sides threw a d6 die. The Red Turbans' d6 die score was 2, and when -1 was added because they were attacking in the flank, and -1 was deducted because their enemy was in cover, the Red Turbans were hit and had to resolve the effect of the close combat. A further d6 die was thrown, and its score was 1. The first Red Turbans had lost 1 more strength point. As they had now lost a total of 4 strength points, their unit was destroyed. A Company of the Guides Infantry Regiment's d6 die score was 5, and when -1 was deducted because they were being attacked in the flank, and -1 was deducted because the enemy unit was in cover, they still remain unaffected by this ferocious, but unfortunately unsuccessful, attack. Both sides started the turn by firing their artillery. The first Hausarian field battery fired at A field battery Royal Artillery. He threw a d6 die and the score was 2. When +1 was added for the artillery unit having a direct line of sight to the target, and +1 was added for firing at the same stationary target during the previous turn, the first Hausarian field artillery battery's fire was deemed to be ineffective. A battery of the Royal Artillery fired yet again at the Great Wall of Morobad. They threw a d6 die. The score was 3. When +1 was added for the artillery unit having direct line of sight to the target area, and +1 was added for firing at the same stationary target as they had done during the previous turn, and +1 was added because they had a friendly commander with the same grid unit as they were, their artillery fire hit the Great Wall for a third time, which resulted in it being breached. Because the 1st Algerian Field Battery was in that on that section of the wall at the time it was breached, it was deemed that they'd been hit. To resolve the effect of the fire, the Algerians threw a d6 die. The score was 5, and the Algerian Field Battery was given the opportunity to either retreat or to lose 1 strength point. In this case, they chose to retreat 1 grid square and keep their full strength. The Algerians moved first this turn, and the red turbans fell back through the clump of palm trees towards the Great Wall of Morobad. The first green turbans left their position on the Great Wall of Morobad and moved forward, so they were just inside the main gate of the Great Wall. In response, General Green ordered A and B companies of the Guards Infantry to occupy the clump of trees, whilst the Loyal Kent Regiment's machine gun company prepared to move forward. On the right, the Egyptian troops continued to advance. Both sides began the turn by firing their artillery. The 1st Algerian Field Battery fired at A Field Battery Royal Artillery. They threw a d6 die and the score was 2. When +1 was added because they had a direct line of sight to the target grid area, and +1 because they were firing at the same stationary target as they had done the previous turn, their fire was still ineffective. A Field Battery Royal Artillery fired back at the 1st Algerian Field Artillery. Its d6 die score was 1, when 1 was added in because they had a direct line of sight to the target grid, +1 was added because they were firing at the same stationary target as they had done in the previous turn, and +1 was added because they had a friendly commander in the same grid area. Their score was still not high enough to make their fire effective. The Anglo-Egyptians moved first this turn, and A Company of the Guides Infantry Regiment fired at the remnants of the 2nd Red Turbans, who had not yet reached the safety of the Great Wall of Morobad. A Company of the Guides Infantry threw a d6 die. The score was 6. And +1 was added because they had not moved this turn. A Company's fire had hit the Red Turbans. To resolve the effect of this fire, the Red Turbans threw a d6 die. Their score was 1, and they lost their final strength point, and the unit was destroyed. A Company of the Mackay Highlanders moved forward and fired for a second time at the Algerian defenders, the 1st White Turbans, who were lining the Great Wall of Morobad. They threw a d6 die. The score was 1, and when -1 was deducted because the target was in cover, the fire from the Mackay Highlanders missed. A Company of the Wessex Rangers moved forward and fired for a second time at the Sultan, who was still on top of the main gate. They threw a d6 die and the score was 6. When -1, because the enemy commander was in cover, was deducted, they had hit their target. 2 6 dice were thrown to see if the Sultan had been killed or wounded. The scores were 4 and 6, which equaled 10, so he just escaped injury or death. Whilst this was going on, the Egyptians had turned to face the Great Wall of Morobad. In response to the developing Anglo-Egyptian assault on Morobad, the 1st Crean Turbans moved to the area under the main gate and opened fire on A Company of the Wessex Rangers. They threw a d6 dice and the score was 5. When +1 was added because of a friendly commander being in the same grid area as the firing unit, they hit their target. It's worth noting that the Sultan may have been on top of the gateway, but he was still in the same grid area as the first green turbines, which is why his bonus was counted in. To resolve the effect of the fire, a company of the Wessex Rangers threw a d6 die. The score was 4, and they could either retreat one area or lose one strength point. In this case, they chose to retreat rather than lose one strength point. The White Turbans fired at a company of the Mackay Highlanders. The first White Turbans threw a d6 die, and the score was 6. When +1 was added because the firing unit had not moved this turn, the first White Turbans had hit their target. To resolve the effect of the fire, a company of the Mackay Highlanders threw their d6 die. The score was 5, and they were given the option of either retreating or losing one strength point. They chose to retreat so that they could maintain as much of their strength as was possible. As in previous turns, both sides fired their artillery first. The first Hauserian field battery fired at a field battery Royal Artillery. They threw a d6 die, the score was 5. But when +1 was added because they had a direct line of sight to the target, and +1 was added because they were firing at the same stationary target as they had during the previous turn, their score was sufficient to ensure that they hit a field battery Royal Artillery. To resolve the effect of fire on a field battery Royal Artillery, the artillery threw a d6 die and the score was 3. As a result of this, the Royal Artillery battery lost its final strength point and it was destroyed. However, as all artillery fire is simultaneous, this did not take effect until a field battery Royal Artillery had fired this turn. Because General Green was in the same grid area as a field battery Royal Artillery, 2 d6 dice were thrown to see if he had been killed or wounded. The d6 dice scores were 2 and 3, which totalled 5, which meant he escaped injury or death. A field battery Royal Artillery fired at the first Hauserian field artillery battery. It threw a d6 die and the score was 6. When 1 was added on because they had a direct line of sight to the target grid area, and 1 was added on because they were firing at the same stationary target as they had during the previous turn, and 1 was added on because they had a friendly commander in the same grid area, and -1 was deducted because the target was in cover, a field battery's Royal Artillery's fire had hit the first Hauserian field battery. To resolve the effect of the fire, the first Hauserian field battery threw a d6 die, the d6 die score was 1, and they lost 1 strength point. The first field battery of the Egyptian artillery now fired at the Great Wall of Morobad. It threw a d6 die and the score was 4. When +1 was added because they had a direct line of sight to the target area, their fire had hit the Great Wall of Morobad and began to demolish a section of it. The Anglo-Egyptians moved first this turn, and except for the Loyal Kent Regiment's machine gun company, which moved forward to the right, General Green decided to keep all his units in their existing positions. In response, the Sultan ordered his troops to remain where they were. The turn started with both sides firing their artillery. The first Hauserian field battery fired at a company of the Mackay Highlanders. It threw a d6 die and the score was 1. When 1 was added because they had a direct line of sight to the target, it was insufficient for their fire to be proved effective. The first field battery of the Egyptian artillery fired for a second time at the Great Wall of Morobad. Its d6 die score was 3, when +1 was added because they have a direct line of sight to the target, and +1 because they were firing at the same stationary target they had done previously. They hit the Great Wall of Morobad for a second time, and visible cracks began to develop in it. The Hausarians moved first this turn. The first cream turbans charged out of the gate of the Great Wall of Morobad and straight at A Company of the Wessex Rangers, whom they immediately engaged in close combat. Both sides threw a d6 die. The cream turbans' first d6 die score was 2, and they were hit and had to resolve the effect of the close combat by throwing a second d6 die. Its score was 1, and they lost 1 strength point. A Company of the Wessex Rangers' d6 die score was 1. They were also hit, and when they threw a second d6 die to resolve the effect of close combat, their score was 2, which meant they also lost a strength point. Once the Hausarians had done all they wished to do, the Anglo-Egyptians had their opportunity to respond. A Company immediately counter-attacked the first cream turbans. Both sides threw a d6 die. A Company of the Wessex die score was 3, and they were unaffected by close combat, whereas first cream turbans' d6 die score was 2, and they were hit and had to resolve the effect of the close combat. They threw a 6, which meant that they could either retreat 1 grid area or lose 1 strength point, and they chose to fall back rather than lose 1 strength point. A Company of the Wessex Rangers could have moved forward, but they chose not to. Whilst this was going on, A Company of the Guards Infantry Regiment fired at the retreating first cream turbans. The A Company of the Guards Regiment threw a d6 die, and the score was 5. When 1 was added in, because the firing unit hadn't moved this turn, they hit the retreating first cream turbans. The first 3 cream turbans threw a d6 die to see what the effect of the fire would be on them. Their score was 3, and they lost yet another strength point. At this point, the number of strength points lost by the Hausarians reached 12, and they had reached their exhaustion point, which meant they could no longer take any further aggressive action, although they could continue to defend the Great Wall of Morobad. The turn started with both sides firing their artillery. The first Hausarian field battery fired again at A Company of the Mackay Highlanders. They threw a d6 die, their score was 4, and when 1 was added because they had a direct line of sight to the target grid, and 1 was added because they were firing at the same stationary target as they had during the previous turn, the first Hausarian field battery's fire hit A Company of the Mackay Highlanders. To resolve the effect of the fire, A Company of the Mackay Highlanders threw a d6 die. The d6 die score was 4, and they could either retreat 1 grid area or lose 1 strength point. As it was, they decided that it was better to fall back than to lose another strength point. The first field battery of the Egyptian artillery fired at the Great Wall of Morobad yet again. It threw a d6 die and the score was 5. When +1 was added for the artillery unit having a direct line of sight to the target grid area, and +1 because they were firing at the same stationary target as they had done during the previous turn, their fire hit the wall for the 3rd time, causing a breach in the wall. Now that the breach had been achieved in 2 places on the wall, the Hausarians had to take a morale test. They threw 5 d6, 1 for each remaining unit but not 1 for the Sultan, and their scores were 2, 4, 4, 5 and 6, which when added together equaled 21. This was greater than the number of strength points they had remaining, as they'd started off with 32 strength points and had already lost 12, as a result of which the Sultan was compelled to surrender. The Anglo-Egyptians had won the battle, and Morobad was now theirs. I hope that you've enjoyed this blow-by-blow account of how I fought a battle using the simple colonial wargame rules the Gatling has jammed from the Portable Colonial Wargame book. I probably went into more detail than most people would require in a normal battle report, but I wanted potential players to see how simple these rules are, and yet how they produce such interesting and at many times fairly realistic results. Well, that brings to an end my rather long video about the attack on Morobad using the Portable Colonial Wargame rules. There will be further Portable Wargame videos in due course, and if you've enjoyed this one, please give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to this channel. That way you'll get notified when new videos appear. In the meantime, enjoy your wargaming.